Deep within the silence of the night, a new awareness begins to take root in the restless human soul. We explore the powerful moments of awakening, where life finally makes sense and the path forward becomes clear. Hit that subscribe button now and wake up to a brand new world with us.
I stood at the window of my study on the second floor, looking down at the backyard where 200 people had gathered to celebrate my retirement. 38 years as a civil engineer, 38 years of bridges and overpasses and highway projects across Ontario and Quebec, from the Gardiner Expressway rehabilitation to the Champlain replacement consultations. And now on a warm September evening in Burlington, all of it was supposed to end gracefully with a glass of Niagara Peninsula Riesling and the people I loved most, standing on my lawn. My name is Edward Kellaway. I was 64 years old that night, and the man I had trusted with my daughter's happiness for 11 years was standing near the drinks table, doing something that changed everything. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what happened. My wife Nora and I met at Queen's University in 1981. She was studying nursing, I was in civil engineering, and we collided at a terrible Faculty of Arts party that neither of us wanted to be at. We stayed married for 40 years. We raised our daughter Stephanie in a small house in Oakville before we could afford the Burlington property, and I watched that girl grow from a child who collected rocks from every construction site I brought her to, into a woman with her father's stubborn streak and, thankfully, her mother's better judgment. At least, I thought she had her mother's judgment. Stephanie married Marcus Henley in 2012. I paid for the wedding. It was held at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake, and it cost me more than my first car and my first renovation combined. But I didn't care. I liked Marcus well enough back then. He was charming in that specific way that made older people trust him immediately. He had a firm handshake, remembered names, and always topped up your drink before you noticed it was getting low. In hindsight, that last detail is not the warm quality I once believed it to be. Marcus worked in financial planning. He had his own small firm, a handful of clients, a leased BMW, and a very expensive wardrobe for someone whose business I had quietly researched and found to be considerably less profitable than he implied. I didn't say anything to Stephanie. She was 31. She was in love. And I had learned by then that pointing out a man's financial inconsistencies to your daughter on her wedding year is a reliable way to become estranged from her. So I watched. I kept a folder. Not out of paranoia. I was an engineer. I kept files on everything. I had a binder for the house renovation, a binder for the car maintenance records, a binder for every major financial decision Nora and I had ever made together. Keeping a file on the man who married my daughter was not suspicious behavior. It was simply how I organized my life. That file would become the most important document I ever assembled. The retirement party was Nora's idea. She wanted something meaningful, something that honored 38 years of work without being mournful about the end of it. She hired a caterer, strung lights through the maple trees in the backyard, rented proper glassware, and invited everyone from my former colleagues at the firm to our neighbors on Lakeshore Road, to Stephanie and Marcus and their 2 children, my grandchildren Penny and Owen, who were 8 and 6 and currently occupied, I could see from the window, in dismantling the dessert table. I was still upstairs. I had come up 20 minutes earlier under the pretense of changing my jacket. But the truth was, I needed a few minutes alone. Retirement terrified me slightly. I had built my identity around being useful, around solving problems with measurable solutions, and I was not entirely certain who I was going to be on the other side of that. I was standing at the window with a glass of water, watching the party below, when I saw Marcus move toward the drinks table. The bar setup was near the back fence, attended by a young woman in a white shirt who Nora had hired for the evening. The special glasses. Nora had ordered 12 champagne flutes engraved with small maple leaves for a toast later in the evening, each one with a guest's name etched in small letters along the stem, a gift from her to the closest people in our lives, were on a separate tray, covered in plastic wrap to keep them clean until the toast. I watched Marcus glance around the yard. Once, twice. Then he reached beneath the tray, did something with his left hand that I couldn't fully see, then walked away toward the far corner of the garden where 2 of my former colleagues were standing. I didn't process what I had seen immediately. My brain tried to file it under benign. He was checking on the setup. He was curious about the glasses. He had dropped something and picked it up, But I am an engineer. I have spent 4 decades observing things and asking whether they make structural sense, and what I had just seen did not make structural sense. I set down my glass of water and went back downstairs. I moved through the party without stopping to talk to anyone, which was noticed and later commented on by at least 3 people. I made my way to the drinks table and found the tray of engraved glasses. The plastic wrap had been partially lifted on one side and retucked, not quite as neatly as before. I found the glass with my name on the stem, Edward, in small clean letters, and I looked at the inside of it. There was a faint residue near the base. Something had been dissolved there and had not fully settled. I stood at that table for perhaps 10 seconds. My heart was doing something I did not like. I looked across the yard and found Marcus standing with my former colleagues, laughing at something, completely at ease. I thought about what I knew about Marcus Henley from 11 years of quiet observation. I thought about the life insurance question he had asked me, casually, over Christmas dinner 3 years earlier. Just making conversation about estate planning, he'd said. I thought about the amount of my pension, which he had somehow known more precisely than Stephanie should have been able to tell him. I thought about the beneficiary forms I had updated 18 months earlier, and then, for reasons I still do not fully understand, changed back the following week. I thought about the term policy I had taken out through work, the one that paid out a substantial sum in the event of accidental death, or death by poisoning, a clause that existed in policies of that era and that I had explained to Marcus during what I had believed was an educational conversation about how insurance products worked. I thought about all of that in 10 seconds. Then I picked up the glass with my name on it, walked to the far end of the garden, and quietly tipped its contents into the flower bed behind the cedar hedge. Then I went back to the table, found Marcus's glass. His name was on the stem as well, and very carefully switched the two. I am not proud of this. I want to be clear about that. What I did was not a righteous act performed in full knowledge of all the facts. It was a panicked act performed by a 64-year-old man who had just seen something that frightened him, and he reacted on instinct before his rational mind could catch up. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have set both glasses aside. I would have called someone. I would have handled it differently. But I was not thinking clearly. I was thinking about Nora and my grandchildren, Penny and Owen, and 38 years of a life I was not ready to have ended by a man in the leased BMW. I pocketed the residue from my original glass. I had scraped it onto a cocktail napkin with my thumbnail, and went to find Nora to tell her I was ready to begin the toast. We gathered everyone on the flagstone patio. Nora stood beside me. Stephanie and Marcus were to my left. My 2 former senior partners, Colin Baxter and Ted Morrow, were front and center with their wives. My grandchildren had been extracted from the dessert table and deposited with a firm aunt near the back. Nora gave a speech that made me cry, which I will not describe in detail because it is private. Then everyone raised their glasses. I watched Marcus lift his. I watched him drink. He made it through the rest of the speech. He made it through the congratulatory handshakes and the photographs. He made it through the first 45 minutes of the open portion of the evening, and I had begun to wonder whether I had imagined the whole thing, whether the residue was condensation, whether I was a paranoid old fool ruining his own party with unfounded suspicion. Then Marcus sat down heavily in one of the garden chairs and didn't get up. I was the first person to reach him. He was conscious but confused, sweating through his jacket, his pupils uneven. I had not practiced medicine in my life, but Nora was a nurse, and she was beside me in seconds, and I watched her face go through the same recognition I was experiencing. Someone called 911. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Marcus was taken to Joseph Brand Hospital. I followed in my own car, after making sure Stephanie and the children had a ride. I sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. When the attending physician came out, I asked to speak with her privately and told her exactly what I had seen and what I suspected. I told her about the residue on the cocktail napkin, which I had kept folded in my jacket pocket. I placed it in her hand. Then I went back to the waiting room and waited for the police to arrive. They came within the hour. 2 officers from Halton Regional, a man and a woman, both younger than my daughter. They were polite but thorough. They took my statement in a small side room near the hospital entrance. I told them everything in the order that had happened. I told them about the party, the glasses, what I had seen Marcus do at the drinks table, what I had found in my glass, what I had done about it. The female officer, whose name I remember as Constable Desjardins, asked me why I had switched the glasses rather than simply alerting someone. I told her I didn't know. I told her it was instinct, and it had been wrong of me, and that I understood it made me look suspicious. She wrote something down and didn't reassure me that it didn't. Stephanie was in the waiting room when I came back out. She had been crying, but she had stopped, and what was on her face now was not grief. It was something harder. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 16, and I had said something she considered deeply unfair. "They're saying you might have done this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I know," I said. "I didn't." "Dad?" "Stephanie, I know how it looks. I need you to trust me." She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "He's my husband," and walked back to the other side of the waiting room, and that was the last full conversation we had for almost 4 months. The next few weeks were the worst of my life, and I have had some genuinely difficult weeks. The toxicology results came back 8 days later. The substance in Marcus's system was identified as a sedative compound, prescription grade, the kind that in a large enough dose and combined with alcohol could cause respiratory depression. It was not immediately lethal. It was the kind of dose that, administered to a 64-year-old man with a mild heart condition, which Marcus knew I had, because I had mentioned it at a family dinner 2 years prior, could plausibly be attributed to a cardiac event at an emotionally stressful occasion. The police searched Marcus's car. They found an empty blister pack in the console storage, the same compound, prescription issued to a patient whose name was not Marcus Henley. It had been prescribed 3 weeks earlier in Mississauga. Then the investigation moved to my files. I gave the Halton police everything I had. The binder I had kept on Marcus's business since 2013. The note I had made after the Christmas dinner when he had asked about my life insurance. The printout of my pension statement that I had found, improperly accessed, in his home office during a visit in 2021. I had photographed it on my phone and said nothing at the time, not wanting to cause a scene. The screenshot of the conversation Marcus had had with Stephanie about my health, which Stephanie had shown me believing she was sharing a concern and which I had quietly saved. The insurance policy was the center of it. The term life policy from my former employer, still active, with a payout that was substantial. Marcus had been named as a secondary beneficiary 3 years earlier at what I had believed was Stephanie's suggestion. 6 weeks before the party, someone had accessed the policy portal, not from my devices, from an IP address registered to a cafe on Lakeshore Road 2 kilometers from Marcus's office, and attempted to change the primary beneficiary. The attempt had been flagged and rejected by the insurer's fraud system. I had received an email about it. I had assumed it was a glitch, filed it away, and not thought about it again. I thought about it now. Marcus retained a defense lawyer within 48 hours, which is his right, and I hold nothing against him for it. The lawyer's initial strategy was to suggest that I had poisoned Marcus myself, that I had staged the entire event, including the switch glasses, to frame my son-in-law for an attack I had actually committed. I want to pause here and acknowledge that this is not an entirely unreasonable theory if you know nothing about me and are being paid to construct a defense. From a purely structural standpoint, it has a certain logic. The man who claims he was the intended victim, who admits to switching the glasses, who was the only witness to the original act. Yes, I understand how that looks. It is what the Crown prosecutor later called the weakest possible defense against the actual evidence. But it was uncomfortable to sit with for the months it took for the case to develop. Nora never doubted me. I want to say that clearly. Not for 1 hour. She sat across from me at our kitchen table on the second night after the party, after Stephanie had stopped returning our calls, after the police had left with my files, and she put her hand on mine and said, "Ed, I have known you for 43 years. Tell me what happened." I told her everything, including the part where I switched the glasses on impulse rather than handling it correctly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that was stupid. I know. But I understand it. Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm furious with you for putting yourself in this position. I know that too. We sat in the kitchen until midnight. That conversation was one of the most honest of our marriage, and also one of the most frightening, and I am grateful for it. The case moved through the system over the following winter. I had retained my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei in Hamilton, who had 30 years of experience and a manner that made me feel, for the first time since the party, that I was not completely alone in this. Patricia found the prescription trail. The sedative had been prescribed under a forged referral to a walk-in clinic in Mississauga. The handwriting on the referral form did not match any physician in the relevant network. The patient name was fictitious. The pharmacist, when shown a photo lineup, identified Marcus. The cafe IP address was traced to a regular patron. The cafe had security footage. Marcus appeared in it on 2 of the 3 dates when the insurance portal had been accessed. There was also the matter of Marcus's business. The financial planning firm, when properly examined under a court-ordered audit, revealed that he had been quietly transferring client funds into a holding account he controlled, slowly enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts for approximately 2 years. The total was not enormous by the standards of major fraud cases, but it was enough to establish that Marcus Henley had a pattern of patient, methodical deception for financial gain. It was enough to establish motive. Stephanie found out about the business fraud on a Tuesday in January. I did not tell her. Patricia told me it was in the disclosure documents and that Stephanie would see it when she reviewed them with her own lawyer. Stephanie called me that Thursday. She did not say much. She asked if I had known about the client accounts. I told her I had not, that I had known he was not as successful as he appeared, but not the extent of it. She asked if I was angry at her. I told her I was not angry at her for 1 second, that she had been deceived by someone who was very skilled at deceiving people, and that the only person responsible for what had happened was Marcus. She cried on the phone for a long time. I listened. The preliminary hearing was in March. Marcus's lawyer made the framing argument, and the judge listened to it with an expression that, from where I sat in the gallery, suggested she found it significantly less compelling than the defense did. The toxicology evidence placed the substance in Marcus's system. The prescription trail linked the substance to a forged document. The cafe footage placed Marcus at the terminal used to access my insurance account. The blister pack in his car had his fingerprints on it. The financial audit established a pattern of covert action for monetary gain, and the cocktail napkin, the one I had kept, the one with the residue from my original glass, had been tested and confirmed to contain the same compound found in Marcus's bloodstream. Patricia had asked me, early in the process, whether I had any regrets about the night of the party. I told her yes, several. I regretted not calling the police the moment I saw what Marcus did at the drinks table. I regretted handling the evidence myself. I regretted not telling Nora immediately. I regretted that my grandchildren would grow up knowing their father had tried to kill their grandfather. She wrote all of that down. She used most of it. Marcus pleaded guilty in April. I was not expecting that. Patricia told me the evidence left very little room for a trial strategy that could reasonably succeed, and that a guilty plea was likely offered in exchange for a sentence recommendation. He received 6 years. With the possibility of parole at the midpoint, he would potentially serve 3. I am 65 now. By the time Marcus is eligible for full release, I will likely be 68. I try not to spend too much time doing that arithmetic. Stephanie filed for divorce in May. She moved with Penny and Owen to a smaller house in Hamilton, closer to her mother and to me. Penny came over for dinner last Sunday and told me that her new school has a better art program than her old one, and that her teacher lets them use real oil pastels. Owen is learning hockey, which I have mixed feelings about because of what it does to knees. But I bought him a proper stick, and I drive him to practice on Tuesday mornings. The children know something bad happened. They do not know the specifics. Stephanie and I have agreed to let them ask questions when they are ready. Nora and I sat in the backyard last week, in the same spot where the party had been a year ago. The string lights were down. The maple trees were starting to turn. We had coffee, and we did not talk about Marcus or the trial or any of it. We talked about a trip we had been meaning to take to Cape Breton for 15 years and had never managed. We talked about whether we should get a dog. We talked about Colin Baxter's plan to hike the Camino at the age of 71, which I told Nora I found inspiring, and which Nora told me she found insane, and both of us were probably right. At some point, she reached over and held my hand without saying anything. I thought about the evening I had stood at the upstairs window watching my party below, not yet knowing what was about to happen, feeling afraid of retirement and uncertain about who I was going to be without the work that had defined me. I know the answer now. I am a man with a very patient wife and a daughter who is stronger than she knew, and 2 grandchildren who are, in the specific way that grandchildren are, the clearest argument for continuing to exist that anyone has ever made. I kept my files. I kept my head. I lost 4 months of my daughter's trust and gained it back. I nearly lost my life to a man who thought I was an easy target because I was old and tired and ready to step back. He was wrong about the tired part. There's one more thing I want to say. For anyone who is listening to this and is in a situation where something doesn't make structural sense to them, where a detail doesn't fit, where someone they are supposed to trust is doing something that, if you look at it from a certain angle, has a shape you recognize as wrong. Trust that recognition. Write it down. Keep the file. I am not saying be suspicious of everyone. I am saying that the instincts built by decades of paying attention to how things hold together do not become useless when you retire. They become more important because you have more to lose and fewer people watching out for you. Write it down. Keep the file. That is all I have. I've thought about that night many times since it happened. Not obsessively. I am not built for obsession. But the way you return to a structural failure in a bridge you once worked on. Trying to understand where the load was distributed wrong. Where the material gave out. What I keep coming back to is not Marcus. He made his choices and he is living with the consequences of them. And I find I have very little left to say about him. What I keep coming back to is the question of how a person ends up in a position where they believe they can quietly erase someone who trusted them. And the answer I come back to, every time, is that it does not happen suddenly. It builds. Small decisions that go unchallenged. Small dishonesties that go unnoticed. A pattern that becomes a habit, that becomes a character. Marcus did not wake up one morning and decide to become the kind of man who forges prescriptions and tampers with drinks at family gatherings. He became that man over years, through a long series of smaller betrayals that no one held him accountable for. The client accounts he bled slowly. The insurance portal he accessed from a cafe 2 kilometers from his office, careful and patient, and certain he would not be caught. He had been getting away with things for a long time before he tried to get away with me. That is the part that matters, I think. Not the dramatic evening with the switch glasses and the ambulance in the hospital waiting room. That was just the moment the pattern finally became visible. I think about Stephanie a lot, about the courage it took her to call me that Thursday in January after she had read the disclosure documents. She did not have to do that. She could have stayed angry at me, kept her distance, protected herself from the humiliation of admitting that she had been deceived for years by someone she loved. Instead, she picked up the phone. That is not a small thing. That is exactly the kind of thing that takes real character to do. Nora never wavered. Not for an hour. And I will tell you honestly that after 43 years together, I sometimes took that steadiness for granted, the way you stop noticing the quality of the foundation under a building you work in every day. That year taught me not to take it for granted anymore. What I want to say, and I am aware that I am an old engineer and perhaps not the most eloquent person to be saying it, is that the things that actually protect you in life are not dramatic. They are not clever or exciting. They are patient and unglamorous. They are keeping records when it would be easier not to. Paying attention when something does not make structural sense. Staying honest with the people who deserve honesty, even when it is uncomfortable. And when something frightens you, not ignoring that fear just because acting on it might cause a scene. I nearly did not say anything that night. I nearly put my suspicion down to stress and age and the particular anxiety of a man who was afraid of retiring and looking for problems to solve. If I had done that, if I had talked myself out of what I saw, I would not be here writing this. Pay attention to what doesn't fit. Write it down. Trust the intelligence you have built over a lifetime of showing up and doing the work. Those instincts exist for a reason. That is the only lesson I have. It is enough.